There's an official explanation for how the modern world was built. Cities grew slowly, populations expanded, governments planned ahead, and infrastructure followed demand. That's the story taught in textbooks, and for most of history, it holds up reasonably well. But in 1816, something unusual happened across 3 continents simultaneously. Cities that had never exceeded populations of 10 or 15,000 people began constructing civic buildings with entrance halls large enough to process 50,000 visitors a day. Train stations rose in agricultural towns before a single rail line had been surveyed. Water systems were installed with pipe diameters calculated for urban densities that wouldn't arrive, in some cases, for another century. And in region after region, separated by thousands of miles and entirely different governments, the architectural scale matched, almost precisely. That precision is worth sitting with for a moment. Not the mystery of it. Not the drama. Just the numbers themselves, and what they imply about the relationship between infrastructure and the populations it was supposedly built to serve. Before going further, it's worth being clear about what this documentary is and isn't. This is a serious examination of architectural and administrative anomalies across the 19th century, anomalies that historians, engineers, and urban planners have documented and debated for decades. Nothing presented here is speculation dressed as fact. Where evidence is incomplete, the story will reflect that incompleteness. Where the record is clear, it will speak for itself. The goal isn't to arrive at a verdict. It's to look carefully at what was built, when it was built, and what the scale of it implies. Start with the most straightforward example, the civic architecture of mid-19th century St. Louis, Missouri. In 1845, St. Louis had a population of approximately 35,000 people. It was a growing river city, commercially active, regionally significant, but by any standard measure, a medium-sized town. That year, construction began on a customs house and post office complex with a floor plan covering nearly an entire city block. The main corridor alone was designed with ceiling heights exceeding 40 feet. The postal processing area was engineered for a volume of mail that St. Louis wouldn't generate until the 1890s, when its population had grown to nearly 500,000. The engineers who designed it weren't incompetent. Their calculations were precise. They were designing for a city that didn't exist yet, and somehow, they got the numbers almost exactly right. Across the Atlantic, in the same decade, Glasgow was undergoing something parallel. A city of 200,000 people, substantial by European standards, began constructing a municipal water infrastructure in 1855 designed to serve over 1 million residents. The Loch Katrine water system involved tunneling, aqueducts, and distribution networks at a scale that engineers of the era described as unprecedented for a city of Glasgow's actual size. By 1900, Glasgow's population had grown to nearly match the system's capacity. The infrastructure had arrived 4 to 5 years early. These aren't isolated cases of ambitious planning. In Leipzig, civic halls built in the 1830s contain administrative chambers with seating configurations that imply governing bodies 3 to 4 times larger than the actual population would have required. In Cincinnati, the 1851 City Hall features record storage systems, vault arrangements, and clock processing areas scaled for a municipal bureaucracy that the city wouldn't need for another 60 years. In Bordeaux, port warehousing constructed in the 1840s was engineered for cargo volumes that the city's actual trade wouldn't reach until the early 20th century. Each case, individually, can be explained. Ambitious local governments. Optimistic projections. Civic pride expressed through grand architecture. These are legitimate explanations, and historians apply them routinely. The problem isn't any single building. The problem is the pattern across all of them, the consistency of the over-engineering, the similar ratios between actual population and design capacity, and the geographic spread of the phenomenon. When a pattern appears simultaneously in Missouri, Scotland, Saxony, Ohio, and southwestern France, the explanation shifts. It's no longer about civic ambition in a particular city. It becomes a question about the conditions that produce the same outcome in radically different contexts. The timing creates its own kind of pressure. The decade between roughly 1845 and 1855 sees an extraordinary concentration of large-scale civic construction across the industrializing world. Not gradually, as you'd expect from organic urban growth. In clusters. As if a decision had been made, or a template had been distributed, and cities were executing against it at roughly the same moment. Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary, completed in 1829, was designed for a prisoner population that the city's crime statistics couldn't have justified at the time. Its capacity implied a carceral system serving a metropolitan area far larger than Philadelphia then was. The designers, including architect John Haviland, were meticulous professionals working from detailed specifications. They weren't guessing. They were calculating. And what they calculated was a facility for a future that hadn't arrived. In Chicago, a city that barely existed as a settlement in 1830, the early civic infrastructure of the 1840s was laid out on a grid system with right-of-way reservations and underground utility easements that implied a city of millions. The grid itself, the famous Chicago grid, wasn't just optimistic. Its engineering specifications, the depth of its drainage assumptions, the width of its boulevard reservations, implied urban densities that Chicago wouldn't reach until decades later. The engineers knew something. Or they were following something. The question is what? Cross the ocean again and the pattern holds. In parts of what is now Poland, civic buildings constructed under Prussian administration in the mid-19th century feature administrative layouts, archive systems, and public processing areas scaled to populations that the actual towns never reached at all, not in the 19th century, not in the 20th, not today. These weren't growing cities that eventually caught up with their infrastructure. These were towns whose design capacity was never filled. Which raises a different kind of question than the ones the growing cities raise. If the over-engineering in St. Louis or Glasgow can be explained by correct long-term projections, by planners who saw demographic growth coming and designed accordingly, then what explains the towns that never grew? The infrastructure that was built to the same scale, following what appears to be the same template, in places where the population arrived at perhaps 15 or 20% of design capacity and then stopped. The pattern, it turns out, is not just about cities that grew into their buildings. It's about buildings that were scaled for a world that, in some places, arrived, and in others, never did. Across documented examples in the United States and Britain alone, the ratio of designed civic capacity to actual population at time of construction clusters, repeatedly, around the same range. 3:1. 4:1. Occasionally 5. Not 10, not 50, which would suggest fantasy. Not 1.2, which would suggest reasonable projection. The same multiplier, again and again, in cities that had no communication with each other, governed by different parties, financed through entirely different mechanisms, built by different contractors working from locally sourced materials. The consistency of that ratio is what makes the individual explanations feel insufficient. The Erie Canal is usually taught as a triumph of American ambition. Completed in 1825, it connected the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, opening the interior of the continent to commercial traffic. What the standard history tends to gloss over is the scale of the infrastructure relative to the economic activity that existed at the moment of its completion. The canal's design specifications, lock dimensions, water volume, towpath engineering, were calculated for freight volumes that wouldn't materialize for nearly 2 decades. Not optimistically calculated. Precisely calculated. The engineers, led by Benjamin Wright and James Geddes, produced documentation that reads less like hopeful projection and more like knowledge of what the system would eventually carry. Their load calculations, their structural tolerances, their contingency specifications, all of it was calibrated for a future commercial reality that couldn't have been reliably predicted from the economic conditions of 1817, when the project began. By the 1840s, the canal was running at close to the capacity its designers had assumed. But in 1817, there was no rational basis for that assumption. The settlements along the proposed route were small. The agricultural output of the interior was modest. The commercial network that would eventually feed the canal simply didn't exist yet. The infrastructure arrived before the economy it served. That sequence, infrastructure before demand, appears across the 19th century with a frequency that eventually stops feeling coincidental. In Britain, the railway network expanded at a pace that historians have long described as irrational relative to existing passenger and freight demand. Lines were built through unpopulated countryside, stations constructed in market towns whose weekly foot traffic couldn't have justified the investment, locomotive capacity installed at depots serving agricultural communities. The standard explanation is speculative investment, railway mania, the irrational exuberance of Victorian capital. But the engineering specifications tell a different story. The gauges, platform lengths, signal spacing, and depot storage capacity weren't speculative. They were precise. They matched, with remarkable accuracy, the traffic volumes those lines would carry once the surrounding areas developed. Development that, in many cases, the railways themselves helped produce. The infrastructure preceded the demand, and then the demand arrived to fill the infrastructure. Which raises a structural question: how do you engineer precisely for demand that doesn't yet exist? The grain storage systems of the American Midwest present the same problem at a different scale. Grain elevators constructed in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio between 1845 and 1860 were built with storage capacities that the surrounding agricultural regions couldn't fill for decades. Not slightly oversized, substantially oversized. The 1854 Chicago grain elevator constructed by IRA Munn had a capacity of 600,000 bushels at a time when Chicago's total annual grain receipts were roughly one-third of that figure. Within 15 years, the elevator was running at capacity. Within 30, Chicago's grain trade had grown to a scale that required dozens of facilities of similar or larger size. Munn wasn't wrong. He was early. The question is whether he was brilliantly prescient or working from a template that implied a scale of economic activity that wasn't yet visible in the data available to him. His engineering contemporaries built to the same ratios. Not just in Chicago, in Milwaukee, in Cleveland, in Toledo. The same multiplier. The same pattern of infrastructure preceding and then being filled by demand. Move to administrative architecture and the pattern becomes harder to attribute to any single economic logic. Government buildings, unlike commercial infrastructure, aren't built to attract the activity that fills them. A grain elevator might be argued to generate its own demand by making storage available. A customs house doesn't create trade. A municipal records hall doesn't generate the population whose records it will store. Administrative buildings are, by definition, reactive, sized to serve an existing population, not to attract a future one. And yet the administrative buildings of the mid-19th century follow the same pattern as the commercial infrastructure. The Cincinnati Customs House of 1851 contained record vault space sufficient for a city of 300,000. Cincinnati's population at the time was approximately 115,000. The vaults weren't decorative. They were functional, engineered with specific shelving systems and humidity management features that implied active use at scale. By 1900, Cincinnati's population had grown to approximately 325,000. The vaults were full. In Buffalo, in Detroit, in Richmond, customs infrastructure, federal offices, municipal halls, the same ratio. 3-to-1. 4-to-1. Sized for a future population with an accuracy that the demographic data of the era couldn't reliably have produced. The British administrative parallel runs through the same decades with its own version of the same phenomenon. Municipal buildings constructed across industrial England in the 1840s and 1850s, in Manchester, Bradford, Leeds, Birmingham, featured chamber configurations, administrative layouts, and public processing areas that consistently exceed the populations they were serving by factors that only make sense in retrospect. Manchester's Town Hall, begun in 1868, was designed for a civic administration whose complexity implied a city substantially larger than Manchester then was. By the time it was completed in 1877, the city was growing toward it. The buildings and the population seemed to be moving toward each other. The population growing up from below, the infrastructure descending from above, meeting somewhere in the middle of the century with a precision that neither organic growth nor individual ambition fully explains. Whether this reflects inherited planning from an earlier administrative system, or a convergence of independent projections that happen to align, the architecture itself doesn't answer that question. It just sits there, scaled to a world that was still arriving. By the 18th century, the term had evolved. Encyclopaedia Britannica's 1771 edition contains a substantial entry on Grand Tartary, describing it as one of the largest political geographical regions in the world, larger than all of Europe, extending from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific. The entry is detailed, matter-of-fact, written in the same register as entries on France or the Ottoman Empire. Not mythological. Not speculative. A geographic and political designation for a real administrative reality that European scholars recognized, if imperfectly understood. Then, across the 19th century, the term quietly disappeared from standard usage. The regions it had described were absorbed into expanding empires, Russian, Chinese, British, and renamed, reorganized, administered under new frameworks. Tartaria didn't vanish because it was proven false. It vanished because the political structures that had given it meaning were replaced by other political structures with other names. That disappearance is the seed of everything that follows. The modern reinterpretation of Tartaria bears almost no resemblance to its cartographic origin. Beginning in online spaces around the mid-2010s and accelerating sharply by 2018 and 2019, a loosely connected body of theory began circulating, part architectural analysis, part alternative history, part pattern recognition, that used the name Tartaria as a label for a proposed lost civilization. The theory, in its most circulated form, suggests that the architectural anomalies of the 19th century, the overscaled civic buildings, the infrastructure preceding demand, the administrative consistency across disconnected regions, are the remnants of a civilization more advanced and more geographically extensive than conventional history acknowledges. The theory spread because it attached a name to observations that were, in themselves, real. The buildings exist. The scale anomalies are documented. The pattern of infrastructure preceding demand is not invented. Historians and engineers have noted it for generations. What the Tartaria framework did was gather these observations under a single interpretive label and propose a cause, that the civilization which built these structures was erased from the historical record, and what we're left with is the physical evidence of its existence without the documentary context that would explain it. That framing is where the serious analysis and the speculative theory diverge. The observations are shared. The interpretation is contested. There are, broadly, three ways to interpret the architectural evidence that this documentary has traced across two phases. The first is the conventional historical model. 19th century planners, engineers, and governments were operating in a period of unprecedented economic expansion and were, collectively, making rational long-term bets on demographic growth. The infrastructure before demand pattern reflects the logic of capital investment. You build ahead of the curve to attract the growth you're projecting. The consistency of the over-engineering across regions reflects the spread of professional engineering education, standardized through European technical institutions whose graduates carried similar methodologies to different cities. The administrative similarity reflects colonial and imperial administrative frameworks that genuinely did export governance templates across vast distances. In this model, the pattern is real, but its explanation is institutional rather than mysterious. The second model is what might be called the inheritance hypothesis. This framework, taken seriously by a minority of architectural historians and a larger body of independent researchers, proposes that some portion of the civic infrastructure attributed to the 19th century was not built in the 19th century, that structures documented as constructed in the 1840s or 1850s were in fact substantially older, built by an earlier administrative system whose records were either lost, suppressed, or absorbed into the documentary frameworks of the empires that succeeded it. In this model, the anomalies in scale make sense because the buildings weren't designed for 19th century populations, they were designed for whatever population preceded the 19th century, and then inherited, reproposed, and redated. The evidence for this model is indirect: architectural inconsistencies, material analysis anomalies, foundation depths that imply earlier construction, and it remains outside mainstream academic consensus. The third model sits between the first two and is, in some ways, the most intellectually uncomfortable. It proposes that a significant administrative reorganization occurred in the early 19th century, following the disruptions of the Napoleonic period, the year without a summer in 1816, and the demographic collapses associated with the early industrial transition, and that this reorganization involved the deliberate construction of infrastructure scaled not for existing populations but for projected post-crisis recovery populations. In this model, governments knew that population levels had dropped dramatically and were building for the recovery they expected, based on pre-crisis population data that no longer matched the world they were building in. The over-engineering isn't optimism. It's memory. A built environment designed for a world that had recently existed and was expected to return. 1816 returns here with particular weight. The year without a summer, caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815, produced catastrophic crop failures across the northern hemisphere. Famine conditions stretched from New England to Central Europe. Population displacement was widespread. In some regions, death rates spiked sharply. The demographic record of the early 19th century is, in places, genuinely difficult to interpret. Census data is incomplete, mortality figures are contested, and the pace of urbanization in the 1820s and 1830s implies rural-to-urban migration at scales that the surviving agricultural records don't fully account for. If a significant population disruption occurred in the 1810s, disruption larger than the standard historical narrative accommodates, then the infrastructure built in the decades immediately following would make a different kind of sense. Not optimism about a future population. Memory of a recent one. The buildings scaled for cities that never developed might not have been built in anticipation. They might have been built in expectation of return. The architectural evidence doesn't confirm any of these models. It's compatible with all three, which is precisely what makes it worth examining seriously and resisting the temptation to resolve prematurely. What the built environment of the 19th century offers is a set of physical facts that outlasted whatever documentary context originally explained them. The documents that might clarify the decision-making behind the Erie Canal specifications, the Glasgow water systems calculations, the Cincinnati vault engineering. Some survive, some are incomplete, some were lost in the ordinary entropy of institutional record-keeping. What remains is the architecture itself, standing at a scale that continues to invite the question its builders apparently never felt the need to answer publicly. Because to whoever commissioned these buildings, the scale wasn't anomalous. It was correct. The strangeness belongs entirely to us, to the distance between what was built and what we can document was meant to fill it. That gap isn't necessarily evidence of erasure. It might simply be evidence of loss. Of the ordinary way that context dissolves while objects persist, leaving behind a world that was clearly organized around assumptions we no longer have access to. Or it might be something else entirely. The evidence, as it stands, invites examination. What you do with that examination is, in the end, yours to decide.